Fantasy Cosmetica is adding a new member to their D&D line of class palettes. This is the Ranger palette, and they're also launching the accompanying Ranger perfume, as well as 4 new nail polishes, and nail polish is a brand new product to the brand, so if you want to learn more about these, please keep watching. Also, in case you're new to my channel, my name is Noopur, and I love indie makeup and all things color and sparkle, and I would really love it if you could give this video a like, and consider subscribing if you aren't already subscribed, especially if you like indie makeup content. Before we get into launch details, I do want to disclose that I received this entire collection in PR and I'm an affiliate with the brand, so you can use my code Noopur to save at checkout, and thank you so much if you use it. Okay, let me read you out some launch details really quickly. So the collection is launching on April 30th at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and the palette itself will retail for $38.99, and there are a bunch of other items and like bundles and stuff, and everything costs like slightly different amounts, so I'll leave the information for all of that in the description box below. Now that all the admin stuff is out of the way, let's get into the close-ups and swatches of everything that is launching. This is the palette cover. I love the stained glass style art the brand has converted to, and I also love to see brands supporting artists and not AI. Then here's the inside color story. This is a 9-pan palette just like their other classes, and it's also magnetic. Here are my various photo swatches so you can see everything swatched out together, but I will be doing detailed individual swatches in a second here along with shade descriptions. Hopping back in really quickly just to let you know how I do my individual shimmer swatches. So I do an opaque swatch up top and a sheer swatch at the bottom, and then when I'm rotating my hand like this in front of the camera, I do it both in focus as well as out of focus just to give you multiple different views of the eyeshadow. Wilderness has a blackened green base with dispersed tiny gold sparkles that shift to green. It is a very smooth shadow with a small particle size. Even though the gold shimmers are fine, they are very visible since they contrast a lot against the deep base. It is sparkly, but not as much as the other shimmers. Marksman has a very sheer green-leaning base with multicolored sparkles. There are green sparkles that shift to pink, but also gold sparkles that shift to green and then teal. This shimmer is very smooth with a small particle size, but still extremely sparkly. Ambush has a sheer peachy base with sparkles that shift pink, peach, gold, and even green at the sharpest angle. This one is also very smooth and very sparkly. It has a slightly dimensional finish, but it's harder to make out the multicolored sparkles. Snare has a pigmented hot orange coral base with gold sparkles that don't shift, but there are also some silver blue-leaning sparkles that blend into the gold. The texture is the same as the previous 2 shades, so it's just as sparkly, but not as overtly dimensional. This is the Ranger perfume. It comes in a hand-painted bottle, and this is the 10 milliliter size, which comes with the spray nozzle. Here's the full list of notes which you can pause to read, and I will talk more about this perfume later in the video. There are also 4 nail polishes launching with this collection. Each of them comes in a 10 milliliter bottle with a decently wide brush. Thorn has a deep gray base with a green to purple multichrome reflect and additional gold shimmers. This is what I'm wearing throughout the video. Claw is a warm and toasty brown shimmer with no shift. It is the least visibly sparkly of all the shades. Fang is a pink to gold duochrome with purple and holographic shimmers. The holo is only visible in strong direct light, and I can't really make out the purple shimmers, but they do make the polish dimensional. Talon is a rose gold shimmer with green to pink duochrome flecks and holographic sparkle. I can't make out the duochrome flecks, but the holo in this one is much more visible. So I'm only going to be doing one look for this video using this palette, and I'm going to keep it a bit more on the simple side, which I'm always saying for these overview videos, but that's typically because I just want to test how the palette performs. Usually it's my first time using the palette, so I don't necessarily want to do anything like too complicated. But more so for this specific video, the reason I want to keep it simple is because I already have a second look planned for this palette that'll be for short form content. And for that, I'm going to be continuing my series. It's a pretty infrequent series, but it's a series where I challenge myself to use every single shade in the palette. And this palette is just particularly inspiring to me to like try to use all of these shades, so keep an eye out for that eventually. It'll probably be sometime next week. Now that I have some eyeshadow on my eye, I always like to mention, just in case you're new to my channel, the way that I do my tutorials is I'm going to be showing you the application on this eye, but I'll already have the step that I'm showing you completed on this eye. That way you can see as I'm building the eyeshadow what I'm working towards. So I'm going to be starting the look with picking up this eyeshadow over here, and I'm going to start by blending this through my crease. So right off the bat, I want to mention I'm usually a build and blend girly, but I have worked with Fantasy Cosmetica's palettes quite a few times before, and I'm familiar with their formula, and I've already done this eye, so I had a feeling, and I did in fact learn, this is so long-winded, I learned that this eyeshadow is a bit on the thinner side, especially since it's a lighter shade, which is pretty common and normal for Fantasy Cosmetica, so I made sure to pick up a bit more of it on my brush than I usually do. And even then, I did dip back in a second time. But I do think that part of it is just like, on my skin tone, light peach shades like this can, I mean, any warm toned lighter shade is going to blend into my skin tone a bit more. I find this to be particularly the case with like mustards and light olive shades, but also a bit with peachy shades like this. But it did still build up fairly easily. I mean, it didn't take me much work to get to this level. I'm also lightly running this on my lower lash line, but I'm not putting like too much pigment on because I just don't think it's going to show up all that much. Now I'm going to dip into this rusty shade over here. I'm going to be applying this on my outer corner here, and usually I like to bring the outer corner like depth shade all the way into like this part of my lid at an angle, but I'm not going to be doing that today. I'm going to be keeping it purely on this outer area here. After packing on the pigment like that, I'm going to slowly start blending it outwards and also bringing it a bit into that peachy shade. I don't want to bring it too much in because I do want a lot of this like lighter tone to remain in this portion of the eye, but there still needs to be a good blend between the two. I'm just gonna buff this out some more as well. I'm hopping over to the lower lash line really quickly with this rusty shade before going back, you know, to this area to blend. Sometimes I just like to make sure that these two are connected first to like be able to visualize what the entire eye is going to look like, and then that helps me kind of like map out how much to blend out this outer area. I'm wiping off my brush a little bit just to make sure that there's no additional pigment on here, and now I'm going to focus on blending this out a bit more. The thing about Fantasy Cosmetica mattes is they may be on the thinner side, but they're also just so easy to blend. So now that I'm happy with this blend over here, I picked up a bit more pigment and I'm going to just pack it in this area right here to deepen it up a bit more without spreading more pigment around. Going back into that first peachy shade, I'm just going to make sure that I'm blending really well between these two shades again. Now I really want to use a contrasting shimmer for the lid, so I'm going to dip into this shimmer right here. And this is going to go over most of my lid, but I am concentrating most of the pigment on the front half of my lid, and I'm going to taper it off, like feather it off as I get to this side of my lid. And using a brush really helps to do that, to get like a more sheer layer of it on the outer half. This shimmer is so sparkly and dimensional and beautiful. It looks like just a green, like a light green shimmer, I feel like on camera right now in this lighting, but when I switch to my sparkle cam, once I have completed the look, hopefully you'll be able to see just how special it is. But the shimmer is very bright and very much on the lighter side, and I feel like it's a little too stark in comparison to these mattes for my preferences, and I need to add a little bit of depth. So I'm actually going to do that with this shimmer over here. So I'm going to start by packing this close to my lash line in a diagonal placement here, kind of like how I usually would take a dark matte onto my lid, but I'm doing that with the shimmer. And this is exactly why I did not put that rusty matte over here. I picked up a little bit more because I do want it to be quite deep and dark right here close to my lash line. And then as there's less pigment on the brush, I'm going to start bringing it upwards a bit, as well as feathering it out. Then I'm going to tilt my head back like this so the light's not hitting the eyeshadow directly, and this is not a very flattering angle, but it does help me to see underneath the shimmer almost, to make sure that like these two shimmers are blending together well and there's not like a harsh line between them. Adding that little bit of depth just like right here on the outer corner really helps make this super light shimmer more wearable for me. And I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on my channel before, but I don't really like wearing such light shimmers all over my lids. It's just like, it's not my preference. I just don't like the way it looks on my lids, and especially with such light matte work, I really need to pair light bright shimmers with some form of depth to make them comfortable for me. But I do know that once I add mascara, I'll feel a lot better as well, because that's another way to add like depth and definition to the eyes. But first I need to finish up the eye, so I'm going to dip into this shade right here for the inner corner. And I just want to do a soft wash of this for my inner corner. I don't want to put on too much because I just feel like, you know, I said this shimmer is super light and bright and impactful, and I don't want the inner corner shade to overpower it. But I will be running it up through the inner swoop to meet the peachy matte over here, because the colors just flow so well into each other. So here's the final look, and I like it so much more now that I have the mascara on, to add a little bit more like definition to the look because like I mentioned, I don't really like soft, low contrast looks on my complexion. I just feel like because I have such dark features like my hair and brows and lashes, I need a bit more definition in my looks to feel comfortable in them. I quickly want to mention what I have on my cheeks because I used the newly released Gourmand Girls Mermaid Magic palette, and I had someone ask if I could use these blushes on my skin because they're really unique tones, and I've already used these two in a previous video, so I used this one today, especially because in the palette it looks like more peachy, and especially compared to these tones over here. So I used it on my face today, and I feel like it looks more pink peach on my skin versus like the orangey peach that it looks in the palette. And I just think color theory is so interesting, and I do really like how it looks on me. It just translates a bit more peachy pink than peachy orange. Here's some quick sparkle cam footage so you can see just how beautiful these shimmers are, because they really just are so dimensional and sparkly, and I love what Fantasy Cosmetica has been doing with their shimmers lately. I feel like they're constantly leveling them up, and I love it. Now let's get into my thoughts on this collection, and I always like to mention that even though I like to get as detailed as possible in this section, it's not a review because I need to use everything so much more, like many more times before it can be considered a true review. Per usual, I'm going to start by talking about this color story, but first I want to mention something that I don't think I have explicitly said before, and that is that I can sit here and critique a color story all day long, but of course everything should be taken with a grain of salt because when I'm critiquing it, I am pulling from my personal preferences, how things perform on my skin tone and things like that. So it's not going to apply to everyone. That being said, I do like to take into consideration as many things that I can think about, like other people's skin tones and preferences and stuff like that. So I just wanted to mention that before continuing. One thing I do know for sure though is that Fantasy Cosmetica is so good at creating curated color stories because they have a lot of these 9-pan palettes for each of the D&D classes, and I feel like most of them have such a good variety of depth and tone and stuff. And like, yes, a lot of them are very just kind of, I won't say monochromatic, but just very curated color stories. For example, this is a bit of a split color story. You have like the warm tones and then you have these green tones, but I feel like you can still get a good variety of looks, and I find that to be true with a lot of their palettes. I will say though, the exception that immediately comes to head is Monk. That was one of my biggest criticisms with that palette, is that a lot of the tones were just so similar that I couldn't really get a ton of different looks from that palette. But this one is jumping right back into their trend of making excellent curated color stories. I feel like you have such a good variety of depth, even with, you know, the limited selection of shades in this palette. You have this one for very deep options, and I feel like typically you would think that you could only pair this with the greens, but I think because this is such a desaturated like olivey shade, I feel like I could add it into, like, I could have added it to the outer corner of this look, and I feel like I would have been able to make it work. So I don't really mind that there isn't a deeper warm shade in this palette because I feel like I could just dip into that to deepen up the look if I wanted to. Something else that I really love about this palette is that I feel like the shimmers and the mattes work so well together. And of course you're thinking, well, yeah, there's green shimmers to go with the green mattes and there's pink shimmers or peachy shimmers to go with the peachy mattes. But in addition to that, I feel like something that Fantasy Cosmetica really took into account is shifts. So you have this shade over here that shifts from like this peachy pink to a green. So you could use it to go monochromatic with these peachy mattes, but you could also pair it with the greens. And because it shifts to a green, when you turn your head to the side or when the light is hitting the shadow from the side, it's going to flash green, making it tie in with those green mattes really well. And conversely, you have this green shade over here that shifts to like a soft pink. It is very dimensional, so there are other shifts going on in there, and maybe the pink shift isn't the strongest, but I feel like that pink peachy shift is going to tie in much better with these peachy mattes than the green shift straight on. Another facet of the shimmers that I really appreciate is that these two over here are very sheer. So they look like they have like respectively a peachy base and a green base, but because they're so sheer, you could pair, you know, the green with the green, the peach with the peach, but you could also layer these mattes over, or layer the shimmers over the contrasting matte. So I could put this over the green, I could put this over any of these two shades, and I didn't layer the green shimmer over a peach over here, but I could have because the base is so sheer that it would work that way. As far as the mattes go, they're the usual good Fantasy Cosmetica quality. They are a bit on the thinner side, but that doesn't mean that they're, you know, not pigmented or not buildable, because with my blending style, I do prefer to build slowly, and I was very much able to get like a good amount of pigment. I also really quickly want to talk about about the shimmer quality because I feel like Fantasy Cosmetica has really leveled up their shimmers. And that's not to say that their previous shimmers were bad by any means, but I just feel like the newer palettes have shimmers that are so sparkly and shiny. It's incredible. And I noticed this shift starting with the Cradled in Ice palette. Those shimmers are some of my favorite shimmers, just like period. There are a couple shimmers in there that are so wet looking and so sparkly and dimensional. I was like, wow, I really hope Fantasy Cosmetica continues making shimmers like this, and they did. All of the shimmers in this palette are super sparkly and also pretty dimensional, which I first noticed the brand doing that with the Fighter palette, which I do have over here. And I feel like these shimmers are just not as sparkly and shiny as these over here, with the exception of Glory in the top row, that blue shimmer. I feel like that's the only one that's on the same level as these, and the rest of these, while they are dimensional with multicolored sparkles, they just aren't quite as sparkly as these shimmers. Now I'm going to move on to talking about the perfume and the nail polishes after this, and I am so excited to talk about these because I don't think I've mentioned this on here, but I am a big indie perfume and nail polish enthusiast. And with makeup, you know, it started off as a hobby, but it's become a bit more of like a work thing for me now. And don't get me wrong, I'm really grateful for it, but it is still work versus perfume and nails, which I just do like for the most part on my own. I don't really talk about them as much on camera. And since I've been on a low buy, I haven't really been bringing in a ton of new stuff into my collection. So the only way I get to add new stuff now is through PR. So I'm really grateful to have been sent these. There are a couple things that I want to point out about indie perfumes that I don't know if everyone knows, and please forgive me if this is something you already know, but I feel like with a lot of indie perfumes, they don't smell the same as mainstream perfumes because I feel like mainstream, especially designer perfumes, people, you know, tend to think of them as like having this like perfumey scent and they all kind of smell the same because they do highly blended perfumes where sometimes it's just kind of hard to make out individual notes. But I feel like with indie perfumes, they do more photorealistic notes and they don't blend them as much so that you can kind of like pick out individual notes. And yes, some notes are not there in as high concentrations. They're more supporting notes, but for the most part, they smell a bit more true to life. The second thing I want to talk about is in relation to indie scents typically being more photorealistic. Not always. Sometimes they do have like fantasy notes in them, and that's something I would love to see from Fantasy Cosmetica down the line. But because they are so photorealistic, and sometimes you're able to just, you know, smell a perfume and pick out those notes because you've smelled these things out in real life. But it's also like the way that you can train your nose to be able to pick them out and also to get the vernacular is honestly, look at the subreddit r/indie makeup and more. So despite the name, that subreddit mostly focuses on indie perfume. And fun fact, that was actually my gateway into indie makeup because I was an indie perfume enthusiast before I was an indie makeup enthusiast. Like, I've been a lifelong makeup lover, but I used to go on that subreddit all the time. Not so much anymore these days, but I used to go on it all the time to like read about perfumes and stuff. And that was how I found out about indie makeup. And then that was like a whole other rabbit hole that I went down. But on that subreddit, they have a daily thread. I don't know if they still have it, but I'm sure there are plenty of posts where you can like read about people describing fragrances. And then also with a lot of indie perfumes, they typically sell samples that are, you know, very small sizes and for, you know, less than a full size perfume. And it's a good way to pick up a bunch of different scents that you may be interested in and kind of like train your nose. But yeah, I just think that that's important when it comes to indie scents. So now I'm actually going to talk about the Ranger perfume, and I'm going to pop up the notes right here so you can pause and digest them at your own pace. So the Ranger perfume is a tomato leaf fragrance, and tomato leaf is different from the tomato fruit or vegetable, whichever one you want to call it. The tomato leaf is much more like green and fresh and crisp. I also feel like tomato leaf was like a very big note in indie perfume a few years ago, and I'm sure there are many more perfumes that have the tomato leaf note in them, but I currently don't have any in my collection. I don't know what happened to my samples that did have that note. I used to have one from Phantom, I think, that was so good, but this one does remind me of it because tomato leaf is quite a distinct note. I'm actually just going to read you my notes from when I have worn this perfume because perfume changes so much over the course of its wear from like the initial spray to the dry down that I like to take notes as I'm wearing it to refer back to because it's hard to remember, to like recall from memory. On the initial spray, I get the tomato leaf, lemon, and a blast of herbs. It is a bit sharp, but in a very earthy way, almost like there's some soil there too, even though that's not a note. It's like walking through the plant section of Home Depot because there's also wood as a note in the base, but more specifically the herb section. I also want to note that the lemon isn't bringing the sharpness, it's more so coming from the herbs. Lemon can sometimes go cleaning supply, but here it feels like it's adding to the freshness. But then the perfume quickly mellows out and some of that sharpness goes away. I can also smell some of the jasmine coming through at this point. It's not too powerful and it doesn't overtake the fragrance. It more so rounds it out to help soften up the scent. And it also makes it more wearable like a traditional perfume. The green heart notes remain though, keeping everything fresh. On the dry down a couple hours later, it mellows out even more and it gets a bit sweet. More of the cedar comes through, but some of the green remains, though not quite as sharp as with the initial blast. It starts to feel more like a traditional mainstream perfume at this point. So hopefully that was helpful if you were interested in the perfume. To me, this is very much a summer fragrance because to me, tomatoes are a summer vegetable, you know? And it's interesting because I feel like with the Monk fragrance, that palette came out a few months ago and it was technically still winter when I got it, but the Monk fragrance to me was a spring fragrance. So I've actually been wearing that more right now because we're in spring and I can see myself reaching for Ranger once we kind of creep into summer a bit. Now let's talk about the nail polishes, and much like indie perfume, I am an avid indie nail polish lover, and most of the time I wear press-ons, most of the time it's an indie nail polish on these. And the first thing that I want to talk about is this bottle because I feel like it's not your traditional square or round bottle. It's got a very unique shape, and these for some reason remind me of like nail polishes from the 90s that my mom would own when I would be digging through her like tiny little nail polish collection, and they just have such an old school feel to them and I really love that. I want to talk about Thorn first because that's the one that I'm wearing on my nails today, and this was 3 coats of nail polish, which I feel like is pretty standard with a lot of special effects nail polishes because for the shimmer to show through, the base needs to be like sheer enough for that shimmer to be strong, but then if the base is sheer, you typically need more coats to build it up. And I do think that if you are painting on your natural nails, you could get away with 2 coats, but because I paint on blank press-ons and I use either nail glue or sticker underneath, and I don't want that to be visible, I do need 3 coats in order to fully obscure that underneath thing. I also did paint the other 3 nail polishes on these swatch sticks, and those also took 3 coats to get full opacity. Talon and Fang both have holographic sparkle in them, but I will say that it's much more visible in Talon than it is in Fang. It's not like you can't see it at all in here, but you really have to look for it in here, versus with Talon, I feel like it's immediately obvious. And then Claw is just like a regular standard shimmer. Nothing wrong with it, but it's just like the most plain, I would guess, of all 4 polishes, and therefore it's my least favorite. Like I said before, Thorn is the one that I'm wearing right now, and this one is supposed to be a multichrome with contrasting gold shimmers, but I don't feel like the multichrome effect is that obvious, and neither are the gold shimmers. It does have a dimensional finish on the nails, but I just don't feel like I can necessarily pick out those colors. That being said, it is still very, very beautiful, and it's definitely my favorite nail polish amongst the 4 because I just feel like it's so unique. I don't have anything quite like this in my collection because it's got a green shift straight on, and I feel like I just don't personally own a ton of green nail polishes in this depth especially, but I also love that it's on this like murky gray base that just makes it so mysterious and cool looking. The formula was just a hair thick, and I don't mean that in a negative way. If anything, I prefer my polishes to be like this because I feel like when they're too runny, then sometimes they take too many coats to build, first of all, but also I feel like they can like just run easily, and if you're painting your natural nails, they can like flood the cuticle and stuff like that. So I find that with thicker polishes, they stay exactly where you want them to. The trade-off with thicker polishes though is that they run the risk of getting a little goopy over time and needing thinner to thin them out, but of course I won't know that until like a year or 2 has passed. Alrighty, that is it for this video. I feel like it's going to be another long one, but that's just the case when collections have more than just, you know, an eyeshadow palette in them. I want to dedicate time to the other products, especially when they are categories that I am just a fan of and have a huge interest in. I tend to just yap about them. So thank you so much for watching till the end. Please don't forget to give this video a like before you go, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!